This is me and Sally again, and we are continuing our journey to basically build and initialize a standardized industrial API communication so we can, build API endpoints, UI components end to end from scratch. If you've never done anything with ASP.NET, or you've been doing ASP.NET for a while, but you don't know where you're going, this is definitely the place to be because this is how I build my software. And I'm gonna, Sally and I last time we were basically working on building the infrastructure in C Sharp, the build components, the GitHub components. This time, just a quick reminder, just like I said before, you have your code in here, and then you push your code to source control. That's GitHub, right? It can be anything else. Could be GitLab. It could be whatever you want. But this is one place, and we already created that, so that's source control. Source control, right? And then, after that, we went ahead and we said, let's build the pipeline. Now, yeah, you have code. I need to have a build pipeline in here. So this is this step here where we go and say, I want to build my components, right? So that's the build step. And then out of that build step, we basically, kind of went and said, okay, if I have my artifacts, because that's what the build does, it will do an artifacts for you. We need to go into a stage that's called release, right? And the release has a prerequisite. So the prerequisite for this release step is to basically have something called a provision, right? So after the build, we need something here called provision. We may or may not need it depending on, how much CI, CD, how many environment that you're building. So this is the provision piece, provision. And then at the very end here, we basically do the release. The release is basically to pick up a bunch of components and deploy them into whatever cloud infrastructure system that you're working with. Okay. Now, what is this all about? Why do I feel like these arrows are kind of out of line? I have a problem with things that are not organized. Okay, there you go. So we have the code. We have the source control. We have the GitHub repo. We did the build pipeline. This is the next step that we're doing today. Today, we need to be able to provision Azure components in C Sharp. So I want to be able to go and say, I want to have the capability to basically create a database resource, to create an app service resource, to create app insights resource, to create all the resources that I could possibly need to be able to basically deploy my service, and put it in some server. Okay. Now, before I can do this, I have to explain something to you here, Sally. So this is the most important part. Since we are dealing, so when people deploy things to the cloud, right, to some server of some kind, there are so many different clouds out there, right? So there is AWS. These are all competitors. You have something like AWS, that's Amazon Web Services. There's a cloud, a system called Azure. That's the one that Microsoft creates. There's one here that's called IBM Cloud. There's Google Cloud. What is a cloud exactly? We need to understand where we're coming from and where we're headed, right? Why do we need these clouds? Why can't we just run the application on our computers and the application is running and whoever wants that application can basically hit my computer and consume the application. So back in the olden days, back when software was still at its infancy, software was technically, I mean, people have been writing software forever, but, the epochs or start date is 1971, I think, or 1969, I think. So what this is that basically the new dawn age of personal computing. Engineers and software engineers being able to write write software, open source software or closed source software and be able to build software and go sell it. This is when Apple and Microsoft kind of took over the world and democratized personal computing for the rest of the world. And then things have evolved a little bit, and engineers started to go and build their own servers, right? So I want to host something in the cloud. That we didn't know, we didn't have a cloud back then, but I want people to be able to visit my website, right? So what engineers used to go do is that they used to go and pay thousands of dollars to buy the hardware to spin up a server. A server is basically just a computer that runs all the time, right? It doesn't have a downtime, it doesn't have any issues. But when you when the development and creating web applications takes so much, time and money, a new solution was begging to happen, which is basically engineers' ability to go and say, I want to be able to just let someone else handle provisioning and taking care of the services for me, and all I have to do is just push my code up to that cloud and let that cloud handle all the work for me. So I don't have to know about the hardware. I don't have to know about any details, and I don't have to pay the cost for it. Imagine it's the difference between paying $50 a month, $50 like this a month, right? Versus going and buying an entire server that could cost you up to $10,000. You don't even know like whether you want to go forward with it or not. I mean, if your business is serious enough, right, go ahead and build a server and whatever you want. But if you want to try something simple, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, let's say you're a startup and you want to try a web application and you don't have a budget of $10,000, it would be a lot easier to pay $500 for a year to see how things are going rather than dumping $10,000 and then throwing all that hardware in the trash. The beautiful thing about the cloud technology as well is that you don't have to worry about maintenance because these things consume power, they need cooling systems. Handling a server is a big deal because a server needs to be within a particular temperature, it needs to be within a particular, environment so it can function at its best capacity. And when something fails in that server, you got to change the racks real quick. So these racks basically is what people say, one processor has failed or one storage has failed. They have duplication and so many different details behind this that this is not the time and place for it. I'm just trying to tell you why are we doing things in the cloud? Why can't I just not run things locally on my machine? Well, now there are so many options out there, right? There is AWS, there is Azure, there is IBM. I'm sorry, Sally, you were going to say something. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just like coughing.
Okay, perfect. So, okay, perfect. Feel free to stop me at any time and ask any questions. There are so many clouds out there, right? There are all these different kind of competitors. Amazon has their AWS, they are the visionary vanguards because they started this whole cloud business. Amazon.com, it had AWS as an internal project. And then it grew up so much that it became a project on its own. And this is why I always tell people if you're building an internal system, build it as if it is a product because you don't know when it's going to go out there and become a product one day. If it's successful enough, it becomes a product. But anyway, this is AWS. And then Microsoft created their own cloud. IBM created their own cloud. Google created their own cloud. And then everyone started to kind of follow suit. Even Alibaba now has their own cloud. And there are many, many of these companies that are trying to offer software as a service, something that people say SaaS, software as a service, where you can communicate, with a cloud system or infrastructure as a service where you communicate with the cloud and you just tell it, I need a server, and it just creates a server for you. You don't have to go buy a server. I need a database, and it will go create a database for you, right? So on and so forth. This is really the whole idea, the whole point of having a cloud system. Okay, how do you determine which cloud is the right cloud? If it's just you and I just building a simple application, it really doesn't matter which cloud system because you're building something really simple and small, so you won't really see the difference in terms of cost and performance and all that kind of stuff. But if you're building some enterprise level application that is massive, then this is when you and I need to sit down and start saying, okay, Amazon is going to cost us this much, but Azure is going to cost us this much, and maybe Google is going to offer us, maybe we have coupons, maybe we have discounts. You're going to start making decisions. Okay. For the time being, we're going to talk about Azure for a little bit. We're going to talk about, something that is simple and I'm familiar with, so I can actually tell you about. I've used both AWS and Azure, and I can tell you Azure is so much simpler, but I'll also give you the whole kind of, details so you can make an informed decision. Now, hear me out on this. Every one of these services, every one of these clouds have their own products and their own protocols. For instance, if you want to spin up a website, just a simple website, right? You can spin up what Azure calls app service. App service. What an app service is just a simple product that Azure sells you, which is basically a space in a server that allows you to deploy your API into an external remote server so people can use it from everywhere in the world. Does that make sense? So far, so
Yes.
good, right?
Yes.
In order for this app service to work, you need a couple of other prerequisites. You need a resource group, something that containerize this app service, just as something for your organization to say, this is my resource group. So I'm going to go here and say, okay, the app service lives inside of something called resource group. That's number one. And the other thing that it needs is that it needs something called plan. Plan. And I'm going to show you what this plan is. So this plan is basically a way to communicate. Let me put that, I don't know, I'll just put it like this. So this is your plan. We have an app service and we have a plan. This plan is basically determines the cost that, it helps you with the resource costs that you have. So if you have a bunch of things inside this resource group, let's say you have a database and an app insights and whatever else is out there, this plan will help you kind of control the cost because again, it's like you're renting someone else's server and they're taking care of the maintenance and all that kind of stuff for you. The plan kind of helps you kind of determine what your cost is, where you can kind of optimize. I don't want to pay 500 a month, maybe 150. That's what this plan does. Okay, so it's a resource group plan. And then on top of this, let's say your app service needs a database, right? You need a database. In order for you to have a database, you can't just have a database. You need to have a database server. That's the server, and the server could have many, many, databases inside of it. So this is a database server, and inside this database server, you have the database. Does that make sense? This is your database, right? And then this guy here is your database server. So I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. Here's my database. And this here is a database server. So this guy can have DB server. So this guy can have many, many databases inside of it, right? This is where your app service goes and talks to this database server so it can save data and put all kinds of good stuff in there. Cool?
Yep.
Okay. So we have this guy. What else do we need? We might need something like something for analytics, something that tells us what's going on with my service. So we go in there and add something called App Insights. Let's see if I have this in here. Insights. Yeah, there it is. Nice. So a little light bulb in here. And this App Insights basically tells you, what's going on with your services. Like this guy is like a watcher. It watches this guy. So it basically goes and looks at your. So let me actually find all your Azure component for you. So it makes things a lot cleaner and clearer. Go down here. There's these no Azure icons that I really like a lot. There it is. This is your app service, and they look exactly like that. Like this is this guy. This is your app service. App service like this, and here's your SQL server. This is your SQL, and this guy is let's see here. Yeah, here's your SQL server right here. So you have a database, and inside the database, there's a server. So I'm going to take this guy out, I'm going to take this out, and this is your database server. Here it is. Inside the database server, you have a bunch of databases inside of it. This is database server. Sometimes you need some of these things, sometimes you don't. Like if you're building a UI component or a UI app that talks to an API, which we're going to do, you won't really need some of these. You won't really need a database because you're not really communicating with a database necessarily. Does that make sense? So
Yes.
you have a go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I say yes, that makes sense.
That's right. Okay. So that's basically these are basically the components. So what do we need to do for our application? We need to be able to programmatically push code that talks to our Azure cloud system to be able to create these things programmatically, right? There's two ways to build these instances. You could just go manually like this and say, let me create my own instances by hand. but that's very dangerous. Why is that? Because that means anybody could just log into your cloud system, and anyone on the team, or someone that is new to the team, or someone that is already on the team and they're having a bad day, they could just go in and do something really dumb, and they could just basically delete a resource, especially if it's in production. So how do you control that? You control that through code. That basically means you have one pipeline that have all access, and one admin, just one admin on this security group. So there's this one guy that is basically having full access to that security group, and he's the person responsible for any issues that happen there. So it's not really a fun thing to have. And then anybody else on the team, should sit behind the code and be able to provision these instances through code. So they basically push code into here, and the code basically creates these cloud instances. Now, before the code gets merged in, there's the build steps, there's the code review. So there's already people looking at the code before it gets merged in. So any action that is being taken on your app surfaces or resource group is being reviewed by team members to make sure that your code, the actions that is being written in here are being reviewed before they happen in the cloud.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So that basically means anybody who's doing a little mistake, let's say someone writing in code that may or may not delete a database, someone here is going to be able to catch that before it happens, right? So it's basically like a gatekeeper that goes and says, wait a second, you can't merge that code in because it's doing something nasty. We're not supposed to do that, right? And engineers, they become a little bit more creative when it comes to building like gateways and gatekeepers and trying to make sure that the code that goes in doesn't impact or hurt anything or anybody else. And this is how the engineering process, especially imagine if you are working on a larger enterprise engineering team, you could end up with like, between maybe 12 to 8, maybe 9 and 10 engineers. I worked on teams where the overall engineering team was a little bit over, I think, 200, and they had their own
Wow.
groups and all that. So you have 8 people, let's say 200 people on a team. Let's start with 8. You have 8 people on the team. These people want to do changes all the time. You want to kind of have build that gateway to make sure that no mistakes are being made when it comes to, provisioning infrastructure components and all that. Okay? So far so good, right?
Good.
So what do people do today versus the style that we're going to be using? Because we're doing something really, really special, something that's very different than how people do things. When people build cloud components, they basically use different technologies, right? You see how when we were doing the build steps, we used a special library that allows you to write C# code so you can, build your pipeline, right? I follow that mindset across all the operations or the DevOps work that you need to do, whether it's provision or build pipeline or release or whatever the case may be. And what that basically means is that you will see a lot of teams today, they will go and say, let me go learn an entirely new technology just so I can provision cloud components. What do people use today to provision cloud components? Let's go here and say provision Azure Cloud Code. So, so here's what you might find, you have your people would use something like managing resources, infrastructure as code. There it is. There it is. So people write things called templates, right? And these templates basically they look like this. They go and say, okay, here's my schema, here's my API profile, here's my, my details, and it has its own kind of, Terraform, which is, a templating tool that people use. There it is, where you have to learn an entirely new technology to be able to kind of provision infrastructure. Right. So infrastructure as code is people going in and doing something like this. So you have the problem that I saw with that is that, well, it's JSON. There's no autocomplete. You don't know what actually needs to go in there or versus what goes in there. It gets really complicated and really hard to kind of work with so fast. So what I said is that, well, there's this way that we can do this, or we can write C# code that we're already familiar with and a technology that we're already familiar with. So we are able to work with building infrastructure as components. So I went ahead and I built this really tiny library in here. And this library basic, not even a library. I basically leveraged an existing UI. Let me just show you here what that means. Let's see if I go into my source code. I think I think it might exist in. Let's see here. Bear with me. I might be able to. Repositories. Let me find the video. So I put that out there in a video, but let me kind of find, I know I always put an example for whatever I build. So there's a nice session here that I'm going to share with you and the people in this channel so people understand how we're building these things. Let's see here. There it is, building Azure infrastructure with C#. Did I leave a code example here? Yes, I did. Of course I did. So you'll see code in here, and this code, what it does is that basically allows you to just go in there and build whatever infrastructure component you want. So of course we have brokers, we have services, processing services, and each and every one of those leveraging an external resource, third-party library, which is the Azure Management App Service Fluent models and all that, to be able to spin up these details. So if you look at the high level, at the provision level, if you go on the services, and then the services processing, you'll see this amazing view here. I go and say, hey, for every resource group, create a resource group and then app service plan. Remember that? We just talked about that one. And then SQL Server, and then a SQL database, and then a web app, and then maybe install some extensions for some third-party library. Does that make sense? So
Yes.
you see how simple this is? This is easy to understand, much easier because it's all autocomplete. You get that power of being able to kind of run and build your stuff, and then you kick it off in your pipelines, and it just runs. It provisions resources, and it runs, and it does all that kind of magic for you. So what are we gonna do tomorrow? Tomorrow I'm gonna walk you through every single step of those. I'm gonna show you each and every. This was just an introduction, just to show you the overview of what we're trying to do. We already built the code, we built the pipeline, we already created APIs and all that. I want to be able to create a resource in the cloud where I can test things and work with things and see if I have an app service and a plan and all that. Create all the components that I need in the cloud so I can run my business. Does that make sense? Any
Yes.
questions there?
Yes. No, it was quite clear, thank you.
Awesome, awesome. We're gonna build this broker by broker. So we're gonna build web app brokers, App Insights brokers, plans, app services, whatever you need in here, we're going to be building those. And let's connect tomorrow and actually start writing code for this. I hope this was useful for you and for the people watching us. And as usual, you guys, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to drop a comment in the comment section. And as usual, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in another video. Thank you, Sally. See you tomorrow.
Thank you,
Bye.
Hassan. Have a good one. Bye.
You too. Take care. Bye.